Hello, students. I am Dr. Natalia. Dr. Dana won't be able to give you a lesson today. So, if you're wondering right now, why is a 14-year-old girl on a screen right now, is because I know a lot more about branding, first of all. So, I will give you a lesson today because he won't be able to. So, I do not know how to start the lesson. I do not know about branding.
But they're going to have fun anyway, though, right?
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay, say adios or something.
Adios.
Okay.
I'm kidding.
Fist bump.
Okay.
Very good. All right, class. We thought it'd be fun to have a little intro from my niece who's visiting us, and we've been having a lot of fun this week with your cousins.
Yes.
Fantastic. You don't have to stay if you don't want to. All right. So this is module 1, module A, when we're talking about what is a brand. And I'm going to get to your questions in about 3 minutes. But the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about these 3 articles and what I think a brand is. So the Dr. Dano definition of a brand is a mental shortcut. Now, that sounds very straightforward, but let's play a quick brand game. And the brand game is, I'm going to say a brand, and you're going to think the first thing that pops into your head. So if I say Mercedes-Benz, what pops into your head? If I say Nike, what pops into your head? If I say Seton Hall University, what pops into your head? If I say JC120, what pops into your head? Now, that idea of what pops into your head, Mercedes-Benz, you might think of luxury, or you might think of a sports car, or you might see the Mercedes-Benz emblem. If I say Nike, you might think of the tagline, just do it. You might think of all the commercials you watched. You might see that swoosh. If I say Seton Hall University, you're probably thinking of campuses or professors or classmates. In other words, each one of those brands that I mentioned, you had a mental shortcut in your head. You already knew something, felt something. There were some neural connections in your head about the brand, Mercedes, Nike, Seton Hall. But when I said JC120, you were like, huh? What? There were no neural connections in your brain for JC120. Unless you play guitar, and you know that that's a Roland Jazz Chorus guitar amplifier, and it's got an incredible stereo chorus, and oh my God, that it sounds beautiful. It's probably one of the best jazz guitar amplifiers you can get. Now, if you were a guitar player, you would have mental shortcuts for JC120. But if you're not a guitar player, you don't have those same mental shortcuts. That's what a brand is. We, the fan, the crowd, the consumer, creates brand meaning. What we think the brand is. Now, this mental shortcut definition and the fan, the crowd, we creating brand meaning, this is the more modern version of branding from a strategic management standpoint. This is very much in the spirit of Holt's article right here. Everything in this article, this cultural model, has this underlying assumption that we, the crowd, creates brand meaning. That there is some kind of a brand meaning out there that a brand can align itself to, like the slacker culture, which then became Mountain Dew's campaign for 10 years. Now, these 2 articles are almost the complete antithesis of a cultural model of branding. Kevin Lane Keller and colleagues, this is the traditional top-down world that we don't live in anymore. This is the Procter & Gamble focused branding of the world, where Mr. Clean has 118 characteristics that define it as Mr. Clean, like muscular, white t-shirt, earring in one ear, bald, arms crossed, jeans. These elements have the assumption that the brand manager and the corporation creates brand meaning, and the brand manager then advertises, communicates what that brand should mean to the crowds and the potential consumers out there. I almost see the cultural model and the brand management model as two completely different models for branding. And given that we live in a on-demand world and a social media world and a crowd cultural world and a movement world, that even the mainstream media follows what's happening via the crowd, I think this model is slowly dying. I wanted to present both to you. I actually think that the brand report card has some very interesting elements to it. I think that the 3 questions that you can ask about your brand have some interesting questions about it. And as a matter of fact, some of you have some questions of how this one bleeds into the cultural model from Doug. But I honestly feel that we are in this cultural model because we don't have any choice, because this is where we are at as consumers, as technology, as a nation. We want to be on demand. We want to do things when we want to do. And the last thing that we want is somebody telling us what this brand should mean or not mean, which is what companies used to do in the past when we had a top-down world, that there was no feedback from the crowd, that there only were 3, 10, 15, 20 television channels, and that mainstream media was the sole source of communicating messaging. Branding was easier back in the day. Everybody watched Friends. Put an ad on Friends and you were fine. Must-see TV, Thursday night. Spend the money. Everybody saw your ads. That world doesn't exist anymore. Hence, you needed to be introduced to Doug and Doug's worldview, which is the worldview that I share the most, especially considering how much time I spend in the social media world. One last thing before we get to questions. I tend to call this world the top-down world, where they think they're in control. In the bottom, they meaning the brand manager, in the bottom-up world, the brand manager is more of a one who listens. He or she hears what's going out in the crowd and then modifies or shifts the brand to meet what is happening within crowd culture. Okay? Let me take a breath. See how we're doing here. So far, so good. All right. Let's go straight into the questions. And you had many questions about these 2 different quote-unquote models, even though they weren't explicit yet. Let's get to questions. All right. And I tried to, these questions are in no particular order, meaning, I didn't rank student questions or anything like that. What I tried to do is I tried to group the questions that had a similar theme so we could answer the same questions basically back to back. All right, so we have Professor Kelly who's leading us off, and she asks, reviewing the module learning objectives for the week, could you elaborate on how we differentiate between traditional brand management and cultural model of building a brand? The Doug Holt article is the cultural model, yes. The Doug Holt article is the bottom-up world, yes. The Doug Holt article fits with our on-demand, social media-powered crowd culture world. The hashtag #MeToo movement, the hashtag BLM movement, I don't see these movements being as powerful or as impactful 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we were still, even though social media existed back then, we were still not a full crowd-powered, on-demand culture, where today we are. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, definitely 20 years ago, the traditional brand management top-down model where the brand manager decides the objectives and tells you, the buyer, what this brand means. Okay. I think that ship has sailed. I don't think we live in that world anymore. All right, Professor Sam. He asks, what is Doug Holt's reasons for saying iconic brands have to fulfill a rebel myth? Okay. From the article, it's clear that this is effective, but he seemed to think it is the only way. Well, it's not the only way. What happens is it's easier to be iconic if you go against the grain. It's easier to be rememberable. It's easier for you to stand out if your narrative, branding, and storyline is the complete antithesis of all the other companies around you. The complete antithesis, therefore, makes you a rebel. You want to be the only one in your category that behaves this way. Therefore, you are a rebel, by definition. Now, Sam says, I can name a lot of brands who aren't rebels, and they're very effective at doing their jobs. Kellogg cereal brands, Bounty paper towels. Now, here's a distinguishing factor, Sam, and to everyone else in class. These are consumer packaged goods that are frequently bought, and that the supply chain and distribution is one of the major functions of success or failure for the product. Kellogg's would not be Kellogg's, and Kellogg's would not have the revenue that Kellogg's has if it didn't have the shelf space power in the supermarkets and the drugstore chains. These are low price products, low involvement products that are purchased frequently, maybe even weekly. When we have products of those classes, then being super iconic and being super rebel is less impactful than having strong positioning in the store where you're bought frequently, online or offline. Okay? We have Professor Kelsey. Professor Kelsey asks, from the 3 questions you need to ask about your brand article, the third question is about points of difference. How often should companies do an analysis of brand performance and imagery and consumer insights to track those differences? Well, Kelsey, in the old school brand management world that Professor Keller and colleagues wrote this article, they would probably only do it once or twice a year. In the bottom-up social media crowd-powered culture, you should probably be doing it daily. You probably should be doing it daily. And it's very easy to do it daily because we have these tools called social media listening tools. And what they do is they pull information to you. It's almost like a reverse search engine. Instead of you looking for something, you put in a query of keywords, and anytime these sets of keywords come up, the information gets pulled to you. So, of course, anything about your brand and anything about your competitor's brand, you're going to see almost in real time. Some of these platforms, there's definitely less than a 60-second delay from the time someone tweets or posts on Instagram. A lot of times it's less than a 15-second delay. You can almost track in real time how as it happens what people think about your company and your brand. Think about companies that had a good week and think about companies that had a bad week. Think about companies that we're going into starting next week is when the Olympics start. And all those major brands, like we've been seeing the Visa ads for the last, 3 months now? And the amazing Simone that's doing those magical cartwheels or something like that to buy her sandwich with the Visa card. We can track in almost real time the brand sentiment around Visa. And at the same time, we could track it against how it's doing versus MasterCard, Discover, or I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. In today's day and age, we're on top of this more frequently. We should, in a cultural model, be engaging with the crowd about our brand. We should. We should be playful. We should not sit back and be passive to the people that talk about our brand. Sometimes we might even have to defend it if they're talking smack and saying untruths about our product or our brand or our service. All right, Professor Madison asks, in the brand report card, there's a line that says, ultimately, the power of a brand lies in the minds of consumers. Sounds very familiar to a Dr. Dana worldview with a mental shortcut. In what they have experienced and learned about the brand over time. Yes, I couldn't agree with that more. When a brand completely is written off by customers and is seen as in a negative light, is there a way for a brand to come back and do a 360? Are they able to do a 180 and reinvent themselves to save the company? Yes, and some of the most interesting cases out there, everyone in this class is way too young to remember this. Way too young. But there was a time where Audi had a really bad run at it in the United States of America. They had a series of cars that would like to accelerate and never stop, and the braking systems wouldn't work. And the Audi brand almost disappeared from the U.S. marketplace. And where's Audi today? The centerpiece of a lot of MCU movies and a lot of other cars out there in the marketplace. Another brand that did a very hip and irrelevant, not only TV, but social media campaign. Old Spice was dead. It was something my grandfather used. And I'm old, and I'm talking about my grandfather. Okay? And now it's like the super hip alternative to, young people due to the ads that they run. It is very interesting, these case studies. Snapple was huge. Snapple's not huge. Snapple's making a comeback. We see these kinds of cycles. Sometimes it happens via nostalgia. A lot of times it happens via Doug Holt style, crowd-powered cultural branding repositioning. Next week, Madison, we are going to do a whole module on positioning, and this will be a wonderful conversation to come back to. Sidebar comment, I also think it's easier in today's world where we all have very, very short memories, and that the news cycle is significantly shorter. Back in the day, top-down media, something could stay in the news cycle for a couple of weeks. Today, if you get more than 24 hours out of something, it's pretty long in the tooth. All right, Professor Oren, he asks, throughout the articles, each one illustrate what builds a brand, makes it successful, and a long-lived brand. What could destroy a brand? Ooh, great question, which is why I listed it after Madison's, where we were talking about negative stuff. Also, marketing and forming a great brand recognition can be extremely costly. It can, or in social media world, it can't. Tesla does not advertise, ever. Yet, they don't have a problem with mental shortcuts. How can a small company ensure that they're able to compete with who may not have the budget as some of the bigger companies? All right, so we have a couple of questions here. Consumer conversation could destroy the brand. That's probably the most common, that negative sentiment within social and digital, i.e., the Net Promoter Score or the recommendation score for a particular brand could be so bad that word gets around and no one will even try. Today's the day that the new Space Jam movie comes out. It was 25 years ago that the first Space Jam movie came out. Many of you were probably young when the first one came out and remember it as a child. And you might have some feelings towards whether you want to watch the new, more modern Space Jam movie. You know, cultural conversation is the number one things that can kill a brand. The other things that could kill a brand is, stupidity from the company standpoint. Bad quality, bad consistency, bad messaging. And it still baffles the bejesus out of me, particularly in social media, that when a company does screw up and makes a mistake, that they then go and defend and call out and try to shame the people who call out the mistake. Oh, does that not go well on Twitter? I'm trying to think of an example. One will come up before the end of this video. It happened recently again, where, the company should just apologize, buy them a new guitar or buy them a new product and move on. Instead, they give it a whole other life by digging their heels in and doubling down. Now, what small companies need to do the most is find out who their crowd is and make sure that you have an ongoing, interactive, two-way conversation with your crowd. They call the phrase, you can Google this, it's like 1,000 true fans. That's all it takes to be successful. 1,000 true fans. And the 1,000 fans will generate enough PR buzz digitally on the social channels to create a true community. And especially if a small company is geographically focused, it's even easier to do. You can take that social media listening tool and you can geofence it. And if someone's talking about your ice cream in Seattle, but your ice cream store is in Charlotte, North Carolina, you only see the conversation about ice cream in the greater Charlotte area and not what someone's talking about in Ohio or Seattle or Austin or in Minneapolis, St. Paul. All right, we have Professor Megan, who has a series of questions here. So let's take a look at them. We're starting to get into our car questions. We have 3 car questions in a row, I believe. How well do you think that a new brand position, foreshadowing the next week's article, will catch on when an industry like the automotive industry has such a defined history and identity? Well, I think that defined history and identity is radically changing. I think consumers are ready for new, interesting, more environmental, more safer, cheaper, technologically advanced cars. The conversation can much easier shift if the benefits clearly outweigh the idea of holding on to history and identity. I mean, Lincoln under McConaughey has had a little bit of a renaissance where Lincoln was dead for a very, very long time there. There's a brand that reborn itself through some pretty good product, more SUVs, and some interesting advertising campaigns with McConaughey. But they're not set up for the future. Not at all. I mean, all of a sudden you're going to start seeing crazy, advanced, technologically interesting SUVs like the new Tesla, the new Hummer, the new Bronco. This is where the conversation is heading. It's great to see such an emphasis on being green, but do you think that customers of brands like Dodge and Jeep be happy with the performance of an E version of their beloved vehicle brands? Well, first of all, the electronic vehicles are faster than anything you can do with a gasoline motor. It just doesn't sound like it's faster. But speed-wise, you can't go faster than electric. Jeep is actually experimenting with a fully electric Jeep. They have an E version in the works. And they're going to need to. Because there's going to be enough consumers that the market is going to move towards electronic or e-versions, that the market is not going to be large enough for a Jeep or a Dodge or a Lincoln or some Ford products to survive. That market's going to shrink. And then when you have scenarios like the EU that's not going to allow vehicles within the borders of the EU that are not electric, it becomes a de facto tariff, and you shrink your market size. I honestly believe that, Chevrolet's 50% of their fleet's going to be electric in the next 5 years. Volkswagen's going to have 2/3 of their fleet be electric within the next 5 years. All those vehicles are already on the books. We're really just starting to see them now from a mass level. We're seeing the ID4. We're seeing the Audi e-tron. We're seeing new Nissan electrics. We're seeing new... Tesla's got 3 more models coming out. Ford's got electrics coming out with that new Mustang thing. What does a brand do when a new positioning strategy doesn't catch on with the market? Well, you go to the crowd, you listen to the crowd, and you find another cultural conversation to latch onto. It doesn't guarantee that, A, you have the right idea. Something hits when the crowd tells you it hits. And if you're experimenting with something and it's not working, then you shift. And in the past, it was actually hard to determine. The marketing research process was slow and it wasn't that accurate and the sample sizes were smaller. Twitter? Woo. Instagram? Woo. TikTok? We can find out things pretty quickly. It won't be very hard for you to determine whether you should go see that Space Jam movie or not. You will know very soon, very quickly, and if you don't get something pushed into your feed already, it only takes about 3 keywords to search on it to see if it's really worth going to see or not. All right, we have Professor Ryan continuing our automotive questions. Looking at the automobile industry, many manufacturers are making the switch to EVs. Yes, and from what I understand, the main point of differentiation are the batteries, range, and the design of these vehicles. Do you think that only a few brands will survive, or will most be able to differentiate themselves long enough to sustain in the new market? I think Chevy, a lot of the big brands are already shifting. I mean, the largest manufacturer in the world is Volkswagen or Toyota. Volkswagen is 100% all in because they're in the EU, and the EU is mandatoring electric vehicles. So, and then all the Volkswagen brands, we have a Porsche question coming up soon, I believe, or we did a Porsche topic talk. That's VW, Audi, Porsche, couple other vehicles that are all using the same battery technology, the drivetrains, the engines, and then guess what? Then you're talking about a lot of vehicles being able to be electric. Ford's doing the same, Chevy's heavily involved. Toyota's a little slow to go here. They're still in the hybrid mode. Nissan has a couple electrics. The Leaf is actually selling well compared to their first one, which was ugly and not very good. I mean, that Hummer, when that comes out, that's going to be major. Major, major, major. Could manufacturers that do not make the switch to EVs have an advantage? No, I really don't think they do. In other words, if you have 1/3 of the market in the US or the EU, or the EU is going to be more than 1/3, it'll be 2/3, buying EVs and not traditional cars, that's going to make the manufacturing and production of a traditional car that much more expensive because you won't be selling as many. It's a domino effect. We're seeing this flywheel spin. We're going to see a really, really monster shift in the next 5 years. Really monster shift. I mean, I have it here. I'm in the market. I'm looking at cars. And, within the first 3 pages, the first story after the top 10 picks, or the second story, is new cars to come. Okay. The next EVs. Here they go. And they talk about 10 models that are coming. We have the GMC Hummer, the Rivian, the Cybertruck, the Ford F-150, the Audi e-tron, another Nissan, another Volkswagen. Volvo is going to have 6 models in the next 3 years. Okay, Vic has Professor Vic has a question. We're still in car mode. I think this is our last car question. Kia notes in its press PR release that it hopes to become an icon. However, none of its marketing decisions seem to conform to the actions detailed in what becomes an icon most. Can brands become icons without integrating themselves into the culture? No, they cannot. Because by definition, if you're part of the culture, you're an icon. And a Kia or a Nike or an Apple or a Volkswagen or a Harley Davidson does not decide or cannot tell a crowd what they think they should think about their product or service. They can suggest, they can have a cultural conversation with a culture and a crowd, which is what Harley does when they have their massive rallies in Daytona and up in New Hampshire and Sturgis. Harley Davidson is there. They're listening to the crowd. They make modifications based on conversations with the crowd. But they really don't tell the crowd what Harley Davidson is. Apple does their best. They do a lot of messaging, but it's really the crowd that decides whether something is successful or not successful, or whether it's part of the culture or not part of the culture. All right, Professor Shannon. What are some of the most popular tools used to audit target audience changes? Preferences and changes with businesses have large curves to impact the internet. I can imagine very difficult to stay ahead of the curve for trends. Shannon, it is not very difficult to stay ahead of the trends. And this is your search. Let's open up a tab. I was looking at branding books here. Top 10 social media listening tools. All right. "20 social media listening tools for 2021. All right, so here's an article. This conversation, social media listening tools, there's a lot of articles out there on it. Every time I look at one of these, the ranking is different. And by the way, this is just not in order of the best to worst, okay? But there's stuff that I've just never heard of. Brand24 I've heard of. I've never heard of Agora Plus. Brand Mentions, never heard of it. BuzzSumo, yes. Sprout is probably one of the biggest players in the marketplace. Hootsuite is probably one of the biggest players in the marketplace. Brandwatch, I heard of. Uscan, never heard of. Meltwater, heard of. NetBase, heard of. Digimind Social, nope. Synthiso, nope. Sife, nope. Keyhole, yes. Mention, yes. Awario, nope. Nope. Sprinkler is very, very expensive. But there's others here that are not even mentioned. Radiant 6 is not on this list. And that's one of the biggest of them all. But Sprout Social and Hootsuite are probably the two most common. My suggestion is either go into LinkedIn Learning or go into YouTube and watch a couple of short, less than 3 minutes videos. Watch a Sprout Social video. Watch a Hootsuite video. So you get a feel for these social media listening tools. They're very powerful. They're very, very good. Now, speaking of social listening and social media, Professor Erica's topic talk was about TikTok. And although she didn't present an explicit question, there was something that I wanted to talk about, which is algorithms and the social platforms. Now, without going off on a huge tangent here, okay, don't want to go off on a huge tangent. We're already at 35 minutes. These platforms have an algorithm that amplifies certain content for certain reasons. Okay? It was a TikTok video that made that ocean spray cranberry spike, TikTok's algorithm made that happen. It made it happen. It pushed that piece of content in more feeds. And TikTok's algorithm, Google's algorithms, Facebook algorithms, they are looking for signs of virality, because every one of these platforms' number one goal, for better or for worse, that's a different conversation, but for better or for worse, their goal is to keep you on the platform. So they want to keep showing you videos that you are interested in, that also everybody else is also interested in. So I don't know what it was about that video, but let's just say it was really, really sticky. And everybody saw it. And anybody that saw it showed it to someone else, or commented, liked, or forwarded. TikTok has a way to measure early growth virality. And when they see early growth virality, they then take that piece of content and start dropping it into more and more feeds. And if it keeps growing exponentially, they drop it into more and more feeds. And if it keeps growing exponentially, it starts getting dropped into more and more feeds. To the point where you open up your YouTube, and one of those top 5 or top 10 most trending videos on YouTube all of a sudden is on everybody's YouTube. So I just wanted to add that little extra flavor of branding and awareness, because these social platforms have this virality aspect to it, powered by an algorithm, and they all have it. TikTok's we know the least about, by the way. Okay, we have one final question. Professor Ashley is going to ask, in the brand report card article, the 10 traits of the world's strongest brand are listed. Okay. How has the pandemic either helped or hindered? Actually, there's another question too related to pandemic, isn't there? No, I only had one. How has the pandemic helped or hindered the ability to assess these brands in a brand, or has been no changes at all? There's no question that the pandemic has hindered significantly, particularly in certain categories, like things that we would do daily that we did out of the house, like going to Dunkin' Donuts or going to Starbucks or going to McDonald's, quick serve kind of, they were radically impacted. That expression, out of sight, out of mind, is very meaningful in categories that are highly competitive, low involvement, low price point. I mean, McDonald's has the data that if they stop advertising, their sales drop. Because McDonald's is in a highly competitive, low involvement, low price point category, that if they don't keep reminding you about McDonald's, their sales will drop. When I was younger, there was the Pizza Wars, and one of the biggest advertisers during the Pizza Wars was Pizza Pizza, Little Caesars. Little Caesars practically melted down, lost 2/3 of their franchises, and almost were erased from the map. They're having a little bit of a renaissance right now, but it's a very small little bit of a renaissance. Subway suffered because we weren't going out to Subways. Every article I read about while picking one for Topic Talk discuss alterations done for the pandemic. So I was wondering how does that impacted a brand report card. Well, the pandemic impacted everything. There were some brands that had a pandemic boost. Zoom, Peloton. What's the trends, like homemaking but crafting, cottage core, right? These are cultural phenomenons that probably wouldn't have happened without a pandemic and all of us being on lockdown. So a lot of things were created more awareness, but a lot of things are, podcasts down. We're not commuting anymore, so why we listen to as much podcasts as we did in the past? Okay, folks, this was our first video. I appreciate it. I appreciate the time. I appreciate the questions. If there are any additional questions to follow up on this, you hit me up on Teams or you hit me on email, okay? Have a wonderful weekend.